On the night of the 6th of April, 1812, the very air above the Spanish city of Badajoz grew thick with the iron scent of blood and the deafening roar of 1,000 cannons. It was a night when the pride of the British Empire was ground into the dust of the ramparts, and where the bravest men in the world looked upon the face of absolute oblivion. Before we venture further into this forgotten labyrinth of courage, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and join our ranks as we preserve the stories of those who stood firm when all hope seemed lost. The siege of Badajoz was not merely a military engagement, it was a descent into a mechanical purgatory designed by the finest engineers of Napoleonic France. To the men of the Light and 4th Divisions, the city was a jagged tooth of stone and iron that bit into the Spanish landscape, a fortress that stood as the final barrier between Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, and the heart of the peninsula. For weeks, the British batteries had hammered at the walls, their iron shot screaming through the air to bite into the ancient masonry of the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions. By the light of a flickering moon, the breaches looked like beckoning doors, wide enough for a regiment to march through in columns of 4. But these were no doors to victory, they were the mouth of a charnel house. General Philippon, the French governor of the city, was a man of cold, calculating intellect who understood that a wall is only as strong as the death one can pile in front of it. He had not merely waited for the British to arrive, he had transformed the breaches into a masterpiece of slaughter. At the base of the shattered stone, the French had dug deep pits, filled them with water, and lined the bottom with upturned bayonets. Above these hung the chevaux de frise, massive beams of oak studded with sword blades, chained together so they could not be moved, creating an impenetrable thicket of sharpened steel. And between these blades, the French had laid bags of gunpowder and shells, wired to explode the moment a British boot touched the rubble. As the clock struck 10, the order was given. In the profound darkness of the Spanish night, 10,000 British soldiers moved forward in a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight. There was no music, no cheering, only the rhythmic crunch of boots on dry earth and the occasional rattle of a canteen against a bayonet. At the head of the columns were the men of the Forlorn Hope volunteers who knew that their primary purpose was to die so that their bodies might bridge the gaps in the enemy's defenses. These were the veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had followed the drum from the hills of Portugal to the plains of Castile, now marching toward a fate that promised nothing but a nameless grave. When the first British soldier reached the edge of the ditch, the world simply vanished in a sheet of white fire. The French had ignited their fugazes, buried mines that turned the earth itself into a weapon. In an instant, the silence was replaced by a cacophony of screams and the staccato rhythm of musketry. The breaches were no longer dark shadows, they were illuminated by the hellish glow of burning carcasses and the flash of exploding shells. Men were tossed into the air like autumn leaves, their red tunics blackened by the blast. Those who survived the initial explosion scrambled down into the ditch, only to find themselves trapped in a tangle of limbs and steel, while from the ramparts above, the French poured a relentless rain of lead into the mass of struggling humanity. It was a massacre that defied description. Officers, their gold lace shimmering in the firelight, stood atop the heaps of dead, waving their swords and screaming for the men to follow, only to be cut down in mid-sentence. The British soldiers, possessed by a grim, desperate discipline, continued to charge. They climbed over the bodies of their comrades, using the dead as stepping stones to reach the chevaux de frise. They hacked at the chained beams with their bare hands, their fingers sliced to the bone by the French blades, while grape shot tore through their ranks with the sound of a giant scythe. For 2 hours, the British army threw itself against the walls of Badajoz, and for 2 hours the wall of lead and fire threw them back. The carnage was so absolute that even the hardened veterans of the Peninsular War found their courage wavering. Wellington himself, watching from a nearby hill, was seen to turn away as the reports of the casualties reached him. The keys to Spain were being bought with the lifeblood of the finest infantry in Europe, and the price was becoming unbearable. The breaches were choked with the dead, the piles of bodies reaching halfway up the ramparts, yet not a single British soldier had managed to crest the summit and hold it. The French defenders, emboldened by their success, jeered at the redcoats from behind their stone parapets, calling out in mockery for the British to come and take the city. In the midst of this slaughter, there was a growing realization among the common soldiers that the traditional methods of war had failed them. The courage of the bayonet and the strength of the arm were no match for the cold geometry of the fortress. The Forlorn Hope had become a literal description of their situation. To charge again was not bravery, it was suicide. The ladders were broken, the gunpowder was damp with blood, and the spirit of the army was being ground away by a foe they could not see and a wall they could not climb. The elite officers of the Horse Guards, the men who had studied the grand maneuvers of the great Frederick and the tactics of the ancient Romans, were at their wits' end. They had no answer for the chevaux de frise, no solution for the mines, and no way to silence the French guns that continued to sweep the ditch with murderous precision. As the midnight hour approached, the scent of defeat began to mingle with the smoke of the cannons. The proud regiments of the Light Division, the men who considered themselves the masters of the battlefield, were falling back in confusion. The ditches of Badajoz had become a graveyard for the British military tradition. It was here, in this moment of absolute crisis, that the focus of history began to shift away from the generals in their gilded hats and toward the men who worked in the shadows. For while the infantry died in the light of the explosions, a small group of men, disregarded by the high command and forgotten by the historians of the era, were looking at the fortress not as a wall to be climbed, but as a problem to be solved from beneath. They were the sappers and miners, the artificers of His Majesty's service. These were men who understood the weight of the earth and the temperament of the stone. They were not interested in the glory of the charge or the honor of the colors. They were craftsmen of destruction, and among them was a corporal whose name would never be toasted in the officers' mess, but whose singular genius was about to do what 10,000 bayonets could not. He stood at the edge of the chaos, watching the useless slaughter at the breach, and he knew with the certainty of a man who had spent his life in the dark that the only way to collapse a fortress was to attack it from where it felt most secure, not from the front, but from below. The carnage at Badajoz remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the British Army, a testament to the staggering cost of a frontal assault against a prepared enemy. But as the fire began to die down and the survivors huddled in the shadows of the ditch, the stage was being set for a different kind of war, a war of silence, of darkness, and of impossible ingenuity. The story of the tunnel rat was about to begin, and with it, the very nature of siege warfare would be changed forever. The fortress of Badajoz, which had withstood the greatest army in the world, would soon find that its greatest threat was not the cannonade from without, but a handful of men with picks and shovels working their way toward the heart of the stone. To understand the blood spilled in the ditches of Badajoz, one must first look across a continent gripped in a fist of iron. By the year 1812, the map of Europe had been redrawn in the colors of the French Empire, a vast tapestry of satellite kingdoms and conquered territories stretching from the windswept Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. At the center of this web sat Napoleon Bonaparte, Boney to the British footslogger, the Corsican ogre to the London press, a man whose shadow fell across every throne and every hearth from Lisbon to St. Petersburg. He had dismantled the old order with the cold precision of a watchmaker, replacing the ancient dynasties of Europe with his own kin and marshals. To the average British gentleman reading the Gazette in his London club, it seemed the light of liberty was being systematically extinguished, replaced by a modern, efficient, and utterly ruthless despotism. The Peninsular War, which had begun as a desperate intervention to protect Britain's oldest ally, Portugal, had evolved into what Napoleon himself would later call his Spanish ulcer. It was a conflict of savage intensity, fought over a landscape of sun-scorched plains and jagged mountains where the traditional rules of 18th century warfare were frequently discarded in favor of a visceral, no-quarter struggle. For 4 long years, the British Army, under the meticulous and often frustrated command of Arthur Wellesley, the Earl of Wellington, had been the only force on the continent consistently standing against the French tide. Yet, for all their victories at Talavera and Busaco, the British remained a small expeditionary force, always operating on the edge of catastrophe. One major defeat would not merely be a setback, it would be the end of British influence in Europe and the total isolation of the British Isles. The strategic geometry of the war in 1812 hinged upon 2 vital points: the fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo in the north and Badajoz in the south. These were the keys to Spain. Built on the main roads between Lisbon and Madrid, they stood as sentinels over the border, preventing any British advance into the heart of the peninsula. So long as these fortresses remained in French hands, Wellington was trapped in Portugal, his back to the sea, unable to strike at the French lines of communication or liberate the Spanish capital. To the French, Badajoz was more than a fortress. It was a symbol of their hegemony, a bastion of the imperial will that had never been successfully stormed by the British. For Wellington, it was a thorn in his side that had to be removed, no matter the cost in lives or treasure. The pressure on Wellington was not merely military, but deeply political. Back in London, the government was weary of the mounting debt and the seemingly interminable nature of the conflict. The British public, while proud of their thin red line, was increasingly skeptical of the high casualty lists and the lack of a decisive breakthrough. The Whig opposition in Parliament whispered of another Corunna, another humiliating evacuation that would leave Britain defenseless. Wellington knew that the clock was ticking. Napoleon was already preparing his Grande Armée for the invasion of Russia, a gamble of such magnitude that it would draw French troops away from Spain. This was the window of opportunity, the moment to strike while the French marshals in the Peninsula Soult and Marmont were divided and distracted. But to seize that moment, Badajoz had to fall, and it had to fall quickly. The French garrison within the city, commanded by the formidable General Philippon, was under no illusions about their task. They knew that if Badajoz fell, the French position in southern Spain would crumble like dry parchment. Philippon had spent months refining the defenses, turning the medieval walls into a modern killing ground. He was a master of the Vauban style of fortification, but he had added his own grim innovations. He understood that the British army, for all its legendary discipline in musketry, lacked a professional large-scale siege train. The British were masters of the open field, but in the slow, grinding science of the siege, they were decades behind the French. Wellington's engineers were few. His equipment was often antiquated, and his soldiers, though brave, were untrained in the delicate arts of the sapper and the miner. This disparity in engineering expertise was the silent crisis of the British Army. The Horse Guards in London, the military elite, still clung to the notion that wars were won by the courage of the infantry and the shock of the cavalry. They viewed the technical branches of the service with a certain aristocratic disdain, considering the work of the engineer to be ungentlemanly and better suited to the lower orders. Consequently, when the British sat down before a fortress, they relied on brute force rather than scientific finesse. They battered the walls with heavy guns until a breach was made, and then they sent their finest men into the teeth of the enemy's fire to force an entry. It was a philosophy of war that traded blood for time, a philosophy that Philippon intended to exploit to its most horrific conclusion. As the British army settled into their trenches in the spring of 1812, the soldiers looked up at the grey stone walls of Badajoz with a mixture of professional respect and deep-seated dread. They knew what was coming. They had seen the failure of the previous year's attempts on the city, where the French had laughed from the ramparts as the British died in the mud. The atmosphere in the camp was one of grim determination, flavored by a peculiarly British brand of dark humor. The men spoke of Boney not as a god of war, but as a nuisance that needed to be put down so they could return to their villages in Yorkshire or the Highlands. They trusted Old Nosey, their nickname for Wellington, but they also knew that his genius for defense was matched by a cold-blooded willingness to sacrifice them if the strategic situation demanded it. Beyond the immediate tactical concerns, there was the broader fear of the Colossus of the North. If Russia fell to Napoleon, the entire weight of the French Empire would return to the peninsula to crush the British presence once and for all. This was the existential threat that loomed over every council of war. The British were fighting not just for a city in Spain, but for the very idea of a world free from Napoleonic dictate. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every day the siege dragged on was another day. Napoleon could consolidate his gains elsewhere. The impossible odds were not just the height of the walls or the depth of the ditch. They were the staggering resources of an empire that could afford to lose 1,000 men for every one Britain could put in the field. In the midst of this grand geopolitical struggle, the individual soldier felt very small indeed. The redcoats were the pawns on a continental chessboard, moved by hand of a man who looked at maps and counted regiments. Yet, it is within this vast, impersonal machine of war that the forgotten genius begins to emerge. While the generals debated the placement of batteries and the timing of the assault, the men in the ranks began to realize that the Boney style of warfare, modern, technical, and ruthless, could only be defeated by something equally innovative. The stage was set for a confrontation between the old world of aristocratic courage and the new world of scientific destruction. The Corsican shadow had darkened the world for too long, and if the British were to step out from beneath it, they would need more than just the bayonet. They would need the mind of a man who understood that the true strength of a fortress lay not in its stone, but in the earth that supported it. The stakes could not have been higher. If Badajoz held, Wellington would be forced to retreat. The Peninsular War would likely be lost, and Napoleon's dominion over Europe would be absolute. The pride of the British Empire was on the line, and the Peninsular Army, that band of brothers forged in the fires of a dozen battles, was about to be tested as never before. They were marching into the mouth of hell, not for glory, but for the survival of their nation, driven by a discipline that the French found baffling and a courage that would soon become legendary. But as the first shovels bit into the Spanish soil, it was becoming clear that the keys to the city would not be found in the hands of a general, but in the calloused palms of a lowly sapper. To understand the man who would eventually hold the fate of the British Army in his calloused hands, one must look past the glittering epaulettes of the officer class and into the soot-stained ranks of the Royal Military Artificers. Corporal James McGraw was not a product of Eton or Sandhurst. He was a child of the Industrial Revolution, born into the damp, subterranean world of the Lanarkshire coal mines. In the 19th century, the British Army was a microcosm of the British class system. The infantry were the muscle, the cavalry the pride, and the officers the soul. But the artificers, the men we now know as sappers, were something else entirely. They were the mechanics of war, men recruited for their trade skills rather than their pedigree. McGraw was a master of the earth, a man who understood the weight of the world above him and the treacherous secrets of the strata below. When he took the King's shilling in 1804, McGraw brought with him a specialized knowledge that most British colonels found utterly baffling. He knew how to read a seam of rock, how to brace a tunnel against 1,000 tons of shifting clay, and how to work in total darkness with only the rhythm of his own breathing for company. In the coal pits, a single spark or misjudged timber meant a tomb for 20 men. In the army, those same stakes were multiplied by the presence of French gunpowder. Yet, despite his vital expertise, McGraw occupied a peculiar lowly position. The Royal Military Artificers were not even considered soldiers in the traditional sense by many of the infantry. They were often viewed as glorified laborers, men who dug the latrines and repaired the wagons while the real soldiers won the glory on the field. McGraw was a man of few words, possessed of a stern Scottish stoicism that the 65 Prus demographic would recognize as the hallmark of a generation raised on hard work and quiet duty. He stood shorter than the average guardsman, his frame compact and corded with the kind of functional muscle that only comes from a decade of swinging a pickaxe in a space 3 feet high. His face was a map of his trade, pitted with the faint blue scars of coal dust and aged prematurely by the sun of the peninsula. While the young ensigns of the 52nd Light Infantry obsessed over the shine of their gorgets and the precision of their drill, McGraw could be found staring at the masonry of a bridge or the slope of a glacis, calculating the exact amount of explosive required to turn stone back into dust. By the time the army reached the walls of Badajoz in 1812, McGraw had survived 4 years of the Peninsular Campaign. He had seen the retreat to Corunna, where he had helped blow the bridges to stall the French pursuit, and he had labored in the heat of the Portuguese summers to build the lines of Torres Vedras. He was a veteran of the dirty war, the war of shovels, gabions, and fascins. Yet he remained an unregarded sapper. To the high command at Horse Guards, the idea of a corporal suggesting a tactical maneuver was not only absurd but bordering on mutinous. The British military hierarchy was rigid, built on the purchase system, where wealth bought rank, and rank bought the right to be heard. A man like McGraw, no matter his genius, was expected to follow orders, not give them. The tragedy of the British Engineering Corps in 1812 was that they were led by officers who were often as brave as they were technically illiterate. The Royal Engineers, the officers, were separate from the artificers, the men. While the officers had the theory, it was men like McGraw who had the practical know-how. During the early stages of the siege of Badajoz, McGraw watched with growing frustration as the engineering plan unfolded. The British were attempting to follow the textbook methods of the great French engineer Vauban, but they lacked the necessary tools, the time, and the specialized labor. The result was a series of shallow, poorly constructed trenches that left the infantry exposed to the murderous fire of the French sharpshooters. McGraw's forgotten genius lay in his ability to see the fortress not as a vertical obstacle, but as a horizontal puzzle. While the generals looked at the height of the walls, McGraw looked at the composition of the soil at the base of the San Roque bastion. He noticed that the French had reinforced the upper masonry, but had neglected the foundational clay where the bastion met the old Moorish footings. To a miner, this was a glaring vulnerability. He knew that a tunnel, properly braced and expertly placed, could bypass the chevaux de frise and the flooded ditches entirely. It was a radical thought, a tunnel rat solution to a gentleman's war. However, the culture of the army worked against him. The British Peninsular Army was a machine designed for the forlorn hope, that suicidal, heroic charge that defined British military identity. There was an emotional gravitas to the idea of a soldier dying in the breach, his face to the foe, his bayonet fixed. There was no such glory in the idea of a man digging a hole in the mud. To the generals, mining was a slow, tedious process that didn't fit the urgent timeline Wellington had set. They wanted the city by the bayonet, not by the spade. McGraw's suggestions, filtered up through the sergeants to the junior engineering officers, were dismissed as the ramblings of a Scottish pitman who didn't understand the dash required of a British soldier. This dismissal reflects the contemporary British sentiments of the era, a pride in the Peninsular Army that was often synonymous with a disdain for the scientific or French way of war. To use a mine was seen by some of the more traditionalist officers as almost unsporting, a coward's way of avoiding the honest slaughter of the breach. They feared the Corsican ogre not just for his armies, but for his modernity, and they clung to their traditional methods as a point of national identity. McGraw, in his humble uniform and soot-stained skin, represented the very thing the British establishment was reluctant to embrace, the rise of the specialist. Throughout the month of March, as the spring rains turned the trenches into quagmires of red clay, McGraw continued his silent observation. He watched his comrades in the infantry being cut down during the sapping process, the slow extension of trenches toward the walls. He saw the forlorn hope volunteers being toasted in the camps, knowing full well they were being sent to a butchery that could be avoided. The emotional weight of this realization was heavy. Here was a man who possessed the key to the fortress, yet he was locked behind the bars of his own social standing. His tactical genius was trapped beneath his corporal's stripes. It was only when the situation turned truly desperate after the first failed attempts to storm the outworks that a few junior officers began to take notice of the quiet Scot who seemed to know more about the foundations of Badajoz than the French who built them. They saw a man who didn't just dig, he engineered. He understood the angle of repose of the debris and the acoustic properties of the earth. He could tell, by pressing his ear to a timber, exactly how far away the French counterminers were. This was the tactical genius that history so often overlooks, the expertise of the man on the ground who sees the truth that the man on the hill misses. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the figure of James McGraw stands as a symbol of the millions of unregarded men who have turned the tide of history. He was the precursor to the modern combat engineer, a man who proved that intelligence and technical skill are just as vital to victory as courage and steel. In the upcoming chapters, we will see how this lowly sapper finally gained a hearing, and how he led a small, shivering team of men into the blackest depths of the earth to do what the entire British Army could not. The story of the Tunnel Rat is a story of a man who refused to be defined by his rank, and who used his forgotten genius to collapse the pride of Napoleonic France. His portrait is not one of a hero in a gilded frame, but of a man in a muddy trench, holding a flickering candle and a rusted pickaxe, looking at a wall of stone and seeing not a barrier, but an opportunity. He was the embodiment of the British working man of the era, stoic, skilled, and utterly indispensable. While the generals prepared their speeches for the aftermath of the battle, McGraw was preparing his tools. He knew that the glory would go to the men on the walls, but the victory would belong to the men in the dark. By the end of March 1812, the British camp before the walls of Badajoz had become a grim theater of frustration. The torrential spring rains had turned the trenches into rivers of red sludge, and the heavy siege guns, dragged with Herculean effort from the coast, were sinking into the mire. Every day that the city held was a day that the French marshals Soult and Marmont drew closer with their relief armies. The great lord, as the men called Wellington, was pacing his quarters with a fury that chilled his staff. The traditional methods of siegecraft, the slow, methodical sapping of trenches toward the enemy walls, were failing. The French engineers were simply too efficient. For every yard the British dug, the French counter-batteries destroyed too. It was in this atmosphere of impending failure that Corporal James McGraw made his move, stepping out of the anonymity of the ranks to offer a proposal that many of his superiors would label as nothing short of suicidal. The meeting took place in a leaking canvas tent, lit by the guttering flame of a single tallow candle. McGraw stood before a young captain of the Royal Engineers, a man named Jones who had seen his own theories shredded by French grape shot. To the officers of the staff, McGraw must have looked like a creature of the earth itself caked in dried mud, his hands stained with the iron-rich soil of the Guadiana Valley. He did not speak with the polished cadence of the officer class, but with the clipped, rhythmic certainty of a man who had spent his life calculating the structural integrity of the dark. He spread a tattered piece of parchment across the map table, a hand-drawn sketch of the San Roque bastion. His proposal was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. While the infantry prepared for another bloody escalade, a ladder assault against the main breaches, he would lead a small team directly under the foundations of the San Roque. "The stone is but a mask, sir," McGraw reportedly said, his voice a low Scots burr that cut through the drumming of the rain. The French have built their strength on the height of the walls, but they have forgotten the weight of the hill. If we can reach the footings of the old Moorish works, we can place a charge that will not just crack the wall, but drop the entire bastion into the ditch." Captain Jones was skeptical. The distance from the nearest British trench to the base of the San Roque was over 60 yards of open, fire-swept ground. To dig a tunnel of that length, properly braced and ventilated, would normally take weeks. McGraw was asking for 5 days. More importantly, he was asking to do it while the French were actively listening for the sound of the pickaxe. In the perverse logic of the era, this was un-British warfare, a sneaking subterranean approach that lacked the dash and spirit of a bayonet charge. The proposal was initially met with derision when it reached the higher echelons of the divisional staff. The dandies, those officers who valued the cut of their coats and the pedigree of their horses, viewed McGraw's plan as a desperate fantasy of the lower orders. They spoke of the pride of the Peninsular Army, of the forlorn hope that was already being recruited from the 52nd and the 95th Rifles. To these men, victory was a matter of moral courage, of standing upright under fire until the enemy's nerve broke. To crawl in the mud like a tunnel rat was seen as an admission of weakness. There was a prevailing sentiment that the British soldier was meant for the sunlit height of the rampart, not the suffocating black of a mine. They feared that if the army began to rely on such scientific tricks, the unique aggressive spirit of the redcoat would be diluted. Yet, as the casualty lists from the trenches grew longer, and the reports of the approaching French relief columns became more urgent, the suicidal proposal began to look like the only alternative to a humiliating retreat. Wellington himself, ever the pragmatist, knew that his reputation and the future of the campaign hung by a thread. He gave the order. McGraw would be allowed to proceed, but he would be given no extra men, no special equipment, and no promise of rescue if things went wrong. It was a pittance of a command, 6 fellow artificers and a dozen volunteers from the infantry who were either too brave or too desperate to care about the odds. They were given a handful of mining picks, a few barrels of villainous saltpetre, and the cold, unspoken understanding that they were entirely on their own. The technical challenges were staggering. The soil around Badajoz was a treacherous mix of heavy clay and loose shale, prone to sudden collapses even without the vibration of heavy artillery overhead. McGraw had to design a silent method of excavation. They could not use black powder to blast through rock. The sound would alert the French counterminers within minutes. Instead, they would have to use wedging, driving iron spikes into the cracks of the stone and prying it apart by hand. It was a slow, agonizing process that required the men to work in shifts of 4 hours, stripped to the waist in the freezing damp, their lungs burning from the lack of oxygen. Every bucket of earth they removed had to be carried back by hand and hidden so that French observers wouldn't notice the growing mounds of fresh soil. Furthermore, McGraw had to contend with the counterscarp, the outer wall of the ditch that was itself a massive obstacle. His tunnel would have to dive deep beneath the ditch, passing under the feet of the French sentries, and then rise sharply to hit the base of the bastion. The mathematics of the angle of repose had to be perfect. If the tunnel was too shallow, the weight of a passing French patrol could cave it in. If it was too deep, they would hit the water table and be drowned in seconds. McGraw worked with a primitive compass and a plumb line, his tactical genius, manifesting as a series of mental calculations that would have taxed a university professor. He was fighting a war of geometry against a foe who held all the high ground. The atmosphere in the small sap where the tunnel began was one of morbid focus. These men were not the celebrated heroes of the forlorn hope who would be toasted with brandy and promised promotion. They were the rat-catchers looked upon with a mixture of pity and revulsion by their comrades. As they prepared to break the surface of the earth and begin their descent, the contemporary British sentiments of the era were vividly on display. The infantrymen passing by the trench would offer grim jests about digging their own graves. Yet there was an underlying respect for the sheer, grinding labor involved. These 65 Prus demographic viewers would recognize the peculiar British grit of the period, the ability to find a sense of duty in the most wretched of circumstances. On the eve of the first dig, McGraw gathered his small team. He did not give a stirring speech about king and country. He spoke instead of the timbering. He explained how to listen for the hollow sound of a French countermine and how to seal a tunnel if it began to weep water. His authority didn't come from his stripes, but from the fact that he was the only thing standing between them and a horrific death by burial. They were about to enter a world where the Corsican shadow was literal, a world of absolute darkness where the only light came from a few guttering candles that threatened to go out if the air grew too thin. It was a suicidal mission because there was no way out. If the French discovered them, they would simply collapse the tunnel from above, turning their workplace into their tomb. As the first pickaxe struck the soil under the cover of a moonless night, the suicidal proposal became a reality. Above them, the grand tragedy of the siege continued to play out the thunder of the great guns, the whistles of the officers and the screams of the wounded. But for McGraw and his tunnel rats, the world narrowed down to the width of their shoulders and the distance of the next swing. They were the forgotten genius in action, moving silently beneath the feet of empires. They were the silent fuse that was being laid into the very heart of the Napoleonic machine. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most courageous thing a soldier can do is to descend into the black and wait for the earth to speak. The stakes were now absolute. If McGraw reached the bastion, he would give the British Army a chance to snatch victory from the jaws of a bloody stalemate. If he failed, his name would be lost to history, his body left to rot in an unmarked hole beneath the Spanish soil, and the breaches of Badajoz would continue to drink the blood of the British infantry until there was nothing left to give. The war beneath the soil had begun, a claustrophobic campaign that would test the limits of human endurance and the precision of a sapper's mind. They were no longer just soldiers, they were the architects of a collapse that would shake the foundations of Europe. The transition from the world of the sun to the world of the shadow began with a single muffled strike of a pickaxe against a root-tangled ceiling of Spanish clay. As the first 6 inches of earth were removed, Corporal James McGraw and his small band of rat-catchers exchanged the grand, horrific theater of the surface for a subterranean purgatory, where time was measured not by the ticking of a watch, but by the steady, rhythmic drip of groundwater and the dwindling length of a tallow candle. To the men of the 5/2 or the 95th Rifles, the war was a spectacle of scarlet and smoke. To the sapper, the war was a space no wider than a man's shoulders, where the air was a stagnant soup of sweat, burnt wax, and the ancient, musty breath of the earth. This was the claustrophobic campaign, a journey into the black that would test the British spirit in ways that the open battlefield never could. The entrance to the mine was a sap, a deep, narrow trench concealed by gabions and sandbags at the furthest edge of the British lines. From here, the shaft dived steeply into the earth, angling downward to pass beneath the massive, stone-lined ditch that surrounded the city walls. The engineering required was nothing short of miraculous given the primitive tools at their disposal. McGraw led the way, his compact frame perfectly suited for the gallery, a tunnel so low that the men had to work on their knees or bellies. Every foot of progress had to be braced with frames, heavy timber supports that McGraw insisted be fitted with the precision of a master cabinetmaker. In the coal pits of Lanarkshire, he had seen what happened when a soft seam was neglected. Here, with the weight of the San Roque bastion pressing down from above, a single loose beam meant a suffocating tomb for them all. The work was conducted in a silence so absolute it became a physical weight upon the eardrums. Because they were digging toward a French garrison known for its vigilance, the use of gunpowder to clear rock was strictly forbidden. Instead, McGraw utilized the grueling method of wedging. An iron spike would be driven into a fissure in the rock, followed by another and another, until the stone groaned and cracked under the unnatural pressure. It was a slow, agonizing process that yielded perhaps only 3 or 4 feet of progress in a 24-hour cycle. The men worked in shifts of 4, their skin turning a sickly, pallid gray in the candlelight, their lungs burning from the damps, the carbon dioxide that settled in the low points of the tunnel. McGraw, ever the forgotten genius, monitored the air quality by watching the flame of his candle. If the light turned blue or began to flicker despite the lack of a breeze, he would order the men back to the surface for an hour of agonizingly thin air. Above them, the siege continued with a fury that felt increasingly surreal to the men in the dark. The vibration of the heavy 24-pounder guns shook the very walls of the tunnel, sending showers of dust and grit down onto their sweating backs. To a man lying in a hole 40 feet below the surface, the sound of a cannonade was not a roar, but a deep, visceral thump that rattled the teeth in one's skull. There was a profound psychological disconnect in this. While the infantry were dying in the light of exploding shells, the sappers were fighting a war of absolute stillness. They were the invisible army, a handful of unregarded men moving like ghosts beneath the feet of the French sentries. The 65 pub retirees demographic who value military precision and the quiet dignity of duty would recognize in McGraw a leadership style that required no shouting or bravado, only the calm, steady assurance of a man who knew his craft. By the 3rd day, the tunnel had reached the midpoint of the French ditch. This was the most precarious segment of the journey. Above their heads sat millions of gallons of stagnant water and mud, held back only by a few feet of clay and the precarious masonry of the counterscarp. If the tunnel breached the floor of the ditch, the mine would be flooded in seconds, drowning every man inside. McGraw spent hours with his ear pressed to the damp earth, listening for the sound of the French patrols overhead. He could hear the clatter of their muskets and the occasional shout in French, vivid reminders that they were operating in the very heart of the enemy's lair. It was a Stygian environment where the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed to blur, and where a man's sanity was as fragile as the timber beams supporting the roof. The technical brilliance of McGraw's impossible odds was his navigation. Without the benefit of modern surveying equipment, he had to maintain a perfectly straight line and a consistent gradient through sheer intuition and the use of a simple plumb line and compass. He was aiming for a specific point in the foundations of the San Roque, a sweet spot where the weight of the bastion's masonry was most precariously balanced. If he was off by even a yard, the eventual explosion would be muffled by the earth, or worse, directed back down the tunnel toward the British lines. His tactical genius was not a matter of grand maneuvers, but of inches and degrees, calculated in the flickering shadows of a subterranean world. The physical toll on the men was staggering. The volunteers from the infantry, many of whom had initially joined for the promise of extra rations or an escape from the trenches, were soon broken by the labor. One private from the 4th Foot reportedly went mad in the darkness, convinced that the Corsican ogre himself was scratching at the other side of the wall. McGraw had to personally lead him out, his calm Scots voice providing the only anchor in a sea of claustrophobic terror. This was the emotional gravitas of the story, the sheer, unadorned courage of men who were doing the dirty work of the empire, ignored by the poets and the press, yet carrying the entire weight of the campaign on their aching shoulders. As they neared the 4th day, the atmosphere in the tunnel shifted. The earth began to change from the heavy, wet clay of the valley to the dry, ancient stone of the Moorish foundations. They were close, but with proximity came a new and terrifying danger, the French counterminers. General Philippon was no fool. He knew that the British might attempt a subterranean approach, and he had placed his own engineers in the cellars of the bastion to listen for the sound of the pickaxe. McGraw ordered the men to wrap their tools in rags to dampen the sound, and the work slowed to a snail's pace. They were now in a duel in the dark, two groups of men digging toward each other, each hoping to surprise and destroy the other before they could be discovered. The contemporary British sentiments of the era, the fear of Boney and the pride of the Peninsular Army, were distilled here into a single, desperate race against time. If McGraw failed to reach the bastion before the main assault was ordered, the slaughter at the breaches would continue unabated. If he was discovered, the French would simply fire a small charge à camouflet to collapse the tunnel and bury him alive. The tension was so thick it was nearly as suffocating as the lack of oxygen. McGraw was no longer just a sapper, he was the thin red line of British hope, threading his way through the needle's eye of history. In the final hours of the 5th day, McGraw's pick finally struck something that didn't sound like rock or clay. It was the hollow, resonant clink of a foundation stone. They had reached the base of the San Roque. The impossible odds had been overcome by the forgotten genius of a Scottish miner. But the victory was far from certain. They were now sitting directly beneath several thousand tons of French masonry, and the French counterminers were so close that McGraw could hear the rhythmic scraping of their shovels through the thin partition of earth. The campaign into the black was over, but the most dangerous part of the mission was about to begin. They had reached the heart of the fortress. Now they had to prepare the villainous saltpeter that would bring it all crashing down. The story of James McGraw is a testament to the fact that the most significant battles are often fought in the shadows by men whose names never make it into the official dispatches. As we move into the next chapter, we will witness the terrifying reality of what happens when two armies meet in the darkness of a tunnel 3 feet high. The into the black phase of the siege had succeeded, but the tunnel rat was about to face a duel that would determine whether the walls of Badajoz would stand or fall. The earth was about to shudder, and the pride of Napoleonic France was about to discover that its greatest enemy was not the British cannon, but the British sapper. There is a peculiar primal horror in the realization that you are being hunted in the dark, and that the only thing separating you from your predator is a few feet of shifting clay and the silence of your own heartbeat. As April progressed, the psychological weight of the task began to press upon Corporal James McGraw and his men with more force than the stones of the San Roque bastion itself. They had reached the foundations, yes, but in doing so, they had entered a space where the French engineers were no longer a distant threat on a map. but a physical presence on the other side of a thin, vibrating wall. This was the start of the Duel in the Dark, a subterranean game of cat and mouse where the prize was not a medal or a promotion, but the right to remain unburied. The French governor, Philippon, was a man of cold architectural intellect. He had not survived years of Napoleonic warfare by ignoring the obvious. He knew the British were desperate, and he knew that when a British general is desperate, he begins to look for shortcuts. Philippon had ordered his own sappers to establish listening posts in the deep cellars beneath the bastion. These men sat in the absolute blackness with their ears pressed to copper bowls or wooden staves driven into the earth, devices designed to amplify the rhythmic clink of a British pickaxe. On the morning of the 4th of April, they heard a faint, metallic scratching coming from the direction of the old Moorish footings. The French countermine was initiated immediately, a frantic, downward dig designed to intercept McGraw's tunnel and blow it into the sky before the main British charge could begin. Within the British tunnel, the atmosphere changed from one of exhausting labor to one of freezing terror. McGraw was the first to realize they were no longer alone. He had ordered a complete cessation of work, a silent watch that lasted for 6 harrowing hours. In that sepulchral stillness, the men heard it, a sound like a giant rat scratching at a wainscot. It was the French. They were not digging for the bastion, they were digging for them. The French were approaching at a right angle, intending to break through the side of the British gallery. To the 65 praise demographic who values the steady nerve of the British soldier, McGraw's response was a masterclass in tactical discipline. He did not panic. He did not order a retreat. Instead, he whispered a single grim instruction to his men. Fix bayonets and douse the glim. The darkness became absolute as the last candle was pinched out. The air in the tunnel, already fouled by the sweat of 20 men, grew thick with the metallic scent of oiled steel and the sour stench of fear. For 2 hours they sat in the pitch black, listening to the French get closer. The sound of the enemy's pickaxes grew from a whisper to a thud, and finally to the terrifyingly clear sound of stone being pried from its bed. A small crack appeared in the right-hand wall of the tunnel, and a thin, sickly beam of light from a French lantern pierced the British gloom. It was a moment of surreal, high-contrast drama, a single ray of light in a world of shadow, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the terrified eyes of the shivering British volunteers. When the breach finally came, it was not with a roar, but with a sudden, sickening crumble of earth. A French sapper, his face blackened by soot and his eyes wide with the shock of discovery, tumbled through the hole into the British gallery. Before he could draw breath to scream, McGraw was upon him. The combat that followed was a visceral, primitive struggle that defied the scientific nature of the rest of the siege. There was no room for the grand maneuvers of the Peninsular Army here. In a space barely 3 feet high, men fought with knives, with short-handled shovels, and with their bare hands. It was a frantic, panting scuffle in the dirt, the only sound being the thud of flesh against stone and the ragged gasps of men fighting for air. McGraw's forgotten genius was tested in this moment of pure chaos. He realized that if this turned into a prolonged engagement, the French would simply bring up a camouflet, a small, portable explosive charge, and seal the British tunnel forever. He had to end the fight instantly, and more importantly, he had to seal the breach in a way that would convince the French they had hit a dead end or a natural cave-in. While his men held the opening against the next wave of Frenchmen, McGraw did something that seemed utterly counterintuitive. He ordered his men to pull back and began to collapse the very roof he had spent days bracing with such care. It was a suicidal maneuver. By removing the king posts of his own tunnel, he risked being buried alive along with the enemy. But McGraw understood the angle of repose of the local soil better than anyone. He calculated that by dropping a specific section of the ceiling, he could create a choke point of loose shale and clay that would fill the French countermine while leaving the main British gallery the path to the bastion just barely intact. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, a moment where the impossible odds were stacked against his own survival. As the French surged forward into the breach, McGraw swung his heavy sledgehammer against the primary timber support. The earth did not just fall, it groaned. With a sound like the world's heart breaking, the ceiling of the gallery subsided. Thousands of pounds of Spanish earth cascaded into the gap, burying the lead French sappers and creating a wall of debris that choked the light from their lanterns. The British tunnel shuddered, the remaining timbers screaming under the sudden shifted weight. For a heartbeat, everything was silent again. McGraw lay on his back, his mouth full of grit, his lungs screaming for air that wasn't there. He reached out into the darkness, his fingers finding the rough, splintered edge of a surviving beam. They were alive. And more importantly, the French countermine was sealed. To the French engineers on the other side of that wall of earth, it looked like a catastrophic structural failure. They heard the muffled screams of their own men and the sound of the collapse, and they assumed the British tunnel had been destroyed by the weight of the bastion above. They stopped digging. They withdrew to the safety of the cellars, convinced that the tunnel rats had been crushed in their own trap. It was a masterpiece of tactical genius through deception. McGraw had sacrificed 20 feet of his tunnel to save the remaining 50. He had turned a defeat into a camouflage, using the very earth as a shield. But the cost was high. The British gallery was now a death trap. The air was so thin that candles would no longer stay lit for more than a few minutes. The men were shaken, their nerves frayed to the breaking point by the experience of the duel in the dark. One of the artificers, a man who had been with McGraw since Portugal, refused to go back into the hole, weeping openly in the trench above. McGraw did not punish him. He simply took the man's shovel, turned his back on the sun, and descended once more into the black. This was the emotional gravitas that defines the story, not the glory of the charge, but the quiet, grim determination to finish a job that everyone else believed was impossible. As the 5th of April bled into the 6th, McGraw and his remaining team worked like men possessed. They had to clear the debris from their own side of the collapse and continue the final push toward the chamber, the hollow they would carve out directly beneath the bastion's foundation to hold the gunpowder. Every shovelful of earth was a triumph of the will. They worked in a rhythmic trance-like state, their movements slowed by the lack of oxygen, their minds focused on a single goal. They were no longer soldiers of the king, they were the ghost of the bastion, a force of nature that the French believed they had already killed. The contemporary British sentiments of the time often focused on the British lion, roaring on the battlefield, but here the lion was silent, dirty, and bruised. McGraw's duel had been won not with a flourish of a sword, but with the calculated destruction of his own work. He had outthought the French, outsuffered the earth, and outweighted the darkness. As they finally began to carve the chamber that would hold the villainous saltpeter, the men could hear the distant, muffled thunder of the British batteries starting their final massive bombardment of the city walls. The main event was coming. The infantry were being lined up. The forlorn hope was being given its final dram of rum. McGraw knew that he was now the only man who could prevent the massacre he had witnessed at the start of the siege. The duel in the dark was over, but the powder train was yet to be laid. He looked at his hands cracked, bleeding, and stained with the red clay of Badajoz, and he knew that the weight of the British Empire was resting in those palms. The French thought they had won the subterranean war. They were wrong. Beneath their feet, in a hole no bigger than a coffin, a Scottish corporal was preparing a surprise that would shake the Napoleonic world to its very core. The 6th of April dawned not with the hope of spring, but with the heavy, sulphurous weight of impending slaughter. On the surface, the British army was a coiled spring of red and steel, 10,000 men waiting for the signal to throw themselves into the charnel house of the breaches. But 40 feet below the mud of the trenches, the world was silent, save for the ragged breathing of Corporal James McGraw and his 3 remaining sappers. They had reached the chamber, a hollowed-out void, directly beneath the primary foundation of the San Roque bastion. The duel in the dark was won, the French counterminers were silent, and the earth had been claimed. Now, McGraw faced his final and most delicate technical challenge, the placement of the villainous saltpetre that would turn this subterranean silence into a world-shattering roar. The gunpowder had been brought down in small, canvas-wrapped packages to avoid the telltale clatter of barrels against the tunnel walls. Each man carried 20 pounds of the lethal black dust, crawling on his belly through the narrow, oxygen-starved gallery. There was a terrifying intimacy to the work. A single spark from a rogue flint, a static discharge from a woolen coat, or the accidental strike of a metal tool would turn the tunnel into a cannon barrel, vaporizing them instantly. McGraw supervised the stacking of the charge with a meticulousness that bordered on the religious. He arranged the powder in a focus pattern, a technique he had learned in the Lanarkshire pits to ensure the blast moved upward and outward, rather than being absorbed by the surrounding clay. This was the tactical genius of the specialist, knowing exactly how to harness the chaotic energy of an explosion to achieve a precise structural failure. To ensure the blast didn't simply vent back down their own tunnel, a disaster known as a blowout, the sappers had to tamp the mine. This involved filling the first 20 feet of the gallery behind the powder chamber with heavy bags of sand, debris, and timber balks. It was back-breaking, claustrophobic labor performed in a space where a man could not even sit upright. They were literally sealing themselves away from their weapon. As each bag was placed, the air grew thinner and the temperature rose, the heat of their bodies trapped in the small enclosed space. By the time the tamping was complete, McGraw was the only man left at the face. He held in his hand the silent fuse, a long, hollowed-out cane filled with a slow-burning mixture of pulverized powder and spirits of wine. Contemporary British sentiments of the era often romanticized the thin red line and the king's colors. But there was no glory here in the sweating dark. McGraw was a man of the 19th century uke demographic, valuing precision, grit, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done correctly. He knew that the Horse Guards would never write a poem about a man crawling backward through a hole in the mud, trailing a length of cane in a prayer. Yet he also knew that if his fuse failed, or if his powder train was interrupted by a damp patch of soil, the thousands of men currently standing at attention on the surface were walking into a massacre from which the British Army might never recover. The emotional gravitas of the moment was staggering. The life of the Peninsular Army was quite literally a thread of powder in his hand. As McGraw worked his way back toward the entrance of the sap, he had to maintain a steady, unhurried pace. To snag the fuse, or to break the continuity of the powder train, would be a catastrophe. He was moving in total darkness now, his candle long since extinguished to prevent an accidental ignition. He navigated by touch, his calloused fingers tracing the timber frames he had built, feeling for the slight changes in the tunnel's gradient. Above him, he could hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the French sentries' boots on the ramparts of the San Roque. They were so close he could hear the muffled click of a musket being checked. The irony was profound. The French were looking out across the plain for the threat, never dreaming that the instrument of their destruction was a solitary Scotsman moving inches beneath their feet. The impossible odds of the mission were now psychological. The human mind is not built for the sustained pressure of subterranean warfare. One of the volunteers waiting at the tunnel entrance later recalled that when McGraw finally emerged into the moonlight of the trench, he looked like a specter risen from the grave, his eyes sunken and red-rimmed, his clothes shredded, and his skin a uniform shade of graveyard gray. He didn't speak. He simply handed the end of the fuse to the waiting engineering officer, Captain Jones. The task was done. The tunnel rat had placed the sting in the tail of the British lion, but the tension did not break with his emergence. The powder train was a fickle thing. The British were plagued by poor-quality fuses and damp powder throughout the Peninsula campaign. There was a very real fear that the mine would hang fire, burning halfway and then going out, leaving the army in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Wellington had set the hour for the general assault at 10 o'clock. The mine was to be the signal, the shattering moment that would unhinge the French defense and provide the infantry with a ramp of rubble to bypass the chevaux de frise. As the minutes ticked toward the hour, the forlorn hope took their positions in the front-line trenches, their bayonets blackened with soot so as not to catch the moon's reflection. The atmospheric silence of the final hour was broken only by the distant tolling of a church bell within the city. The British soldiers, veterans of the Peninsular Army, stood in a grim, disciplined silence that was a hallmark of the era. These were men who had been flogged for the slightest infraction, yet they would follow their officers into the mouth of a cannon without a second thought. McGraw stood among them, a lowly sapper whose work was finished, watching the officers check their pocket watches. He felt a strange sense of detachment. He had lived with the San Roque bastion for 5 days. He knew its foundations, its weaknesses, and its secrets. He knew that beneath that proud stone facade, a forgotten genius had planted a terminal illness. The order was given. A subaltern with a glowing linstock stepped forward to the mouth of the sap. With a steady hand, he touched the fire to McGraw's fuse. There was a small, sharp hiss, the sound of a snake in the grass as the powder ignited. The fire began its journey into the black, racing down the gallery, through the tamping and toward the heart of the fortress. For McGraw, the next few minutes were a lifetime. He counted the seconds, his mind tracing the fire's progress through the tunnel he had dug, past the first frame, through the squeeze, over the collapse. This was the silent fuse in every sense. While the world above waited for the roar of the assault, the real war was a tiny spark traveling through the earth. If it reached the chamber, the Corsican shadow would be lifted from Badajoz. If it failed, the butcher's bill would be paid in full on the ramparts. McGraw closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the damp wall of the trench. He had done all that a man could do. The physics of the earth and the chemistry of the powder would now decide the fate of empires. The tactical genius had provided the means. Now, the world waited for the earth to shudder. The powder train represents the pinnacle of the sapper's art, a blend of cold calculation and suicidal bravery. As we move into the climax of our story, We will witness the moment when McGraw's silent work became the loudest voice in the Peninsular War. The fuse was burning, the infantry were tensed, and the impossible odds were about to be shattered by a single catastrophic moment of engineering perfection. The tunnel rat had done his duty. Now it was time for the fortress to die. At precisely 10 o'clock, the world did not explode with a bang, but with a profound, low-frequency thud that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the earth. For those standing in the British trenches, it felt as though the ground had momentarily turned to liquid. There was a heartbeat of unnatural silence, a vacuum in time where the cheering of the French and the roar of the British batteries simply ceased to exist. Then, the Sanroque bastion, that impregnable sentinel at the French defense, did something that defied the laws of masonry. It did not merely crumble, it heaved upward, a slow, majestic rise of 10,000 tons of stone and earth, before collapsing back into the ditch in a gargantuan cloud of dust and fire. The shattering moment had arrived. To the French defenders atop the ramparts, the sensation was one of absolute betrayal by the earth itself. One moment, they were firing down into the dark at the approaching shadows of the British infantry. The next, the very floor of their world had vanished. The explosion, directed with the tactical genius of McGraw's Lanarkshire training, had not merely cracked the wall, it had liquefied the foundations. The massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, were tossed into the air like children's toys, only to come crashing down upon the chevaux de frise in the flooded pits. In a single violent stroke, the impossible odds had been rewritten. The impenetrable thicket of sword blades and the drowning pools of the ditch were buried under a providential ramp of broken stone. For Corporal James McGraw, standing at the mouth of the sap, the moment was one of high-contrast sensory overload. The shockwave had flattened every man in the trench, the air suddenly thick with the smell of ancient dust and the ozone of the blast. As the debris began to rain down, bits of French uniforms, shards of timber, and pulverized mortar, the tunnel rat looked up to see a jagged, glowing canyon where a wall had once been. The silent fuse had spoken. The Corsican shadow over Badajoz was no longer a solid wall, it was a doorway. The British infantry, who had been waiting in a state of agonizing tension, did not wait for the dust to settle. The forlorn hope of the 52nd, led by officers whose names would soon be etched in the annals of British military history, surged forward with a roar that drowned out the dying echoes of the mine. This was the discipline of the Peninsular Army at its peak. They did not scramble. They flowed like a river of scarlet into the breach. Where before there had been only certain death, there was now a path. They climbed the rubble McGraw had provided, their boots slipping on the fresh-turned earth, their bayonets glistening in the hellish light of the burning city. The French, though shattered by the explosion, were not yet defeated. Philippon's garrison was comprised of veterans who had fought across the breadth of Europe, and they rallied with a desperate, savage energy. From the inner works they poured a relentless fire into the breach, the muzzle flashes illuminating a scene of carnage that looked like a vision from Dante's Inferno. But the momentum had shifted. The confidence of the French was shattered not just by the loss of the wall, but by the psychological shock of the mine. They had believed themselves safe behind their science, only to be undone by a more primitive, more brutal science from below. McGraw watched as the regiments he had served alongside disappeared into the smoke. He saw the colors of the 4th Foot crest the top of the rubble, a sight that brought a rare, grim smile to his soot-stained face. The emotional gravitas of the moment was profound. He was a lowly sapper, a man who worked in the dark and the dirt, yet he had just cleared the way for the pride of the empire. The numerical disparity and the technical advantages of the French had been negated by 40 feet of tunnel and a few barrels of powder. It was a victory of the mind over the mountain. The battle within the breach was a slow-motion nightmare of hand-to-hand-to-hand combat. The British soldiers, fueled by the rage of the previous week's failures and the adrenaline of the blast, fought with a ferocity that contemporary British sentiments often ascribed to the British bulldog spirit. They were not fighting for glory now. They were fighting for the man next to them and for the simple primal urge to reach the top of that hill. The French defenders, trapped between the wreckage of their bastion and the advancing red tide, fought with the desperation of cornered wolves. The breach became a meat grinder, a place where the sophisticated tactics of the era were forgotten in favor of the clubbed musket and the short blade. Yet, as the minutes turned to hours, the weight of the British assault began to tell. The gap McGraw had created was too wide to be plugged by a few companies of French grenadiers. More and more redcoats poured through the opening, fanning out into the streets of the city. The keys to Spain were being turned. The strategic impact of the mine was becoming clear. By collapsing the Sanroque, McGraw had not just provided an entry point, he had unhinged the entire defensive line of the city, forcing the French to divert troops from the other breaches to deal with the disaster. It was the unprecedented maneuver that the generals had deemed suicidal, and it was working. Throughout the night, the city of Badajoz was a cauldron of fire and screaming steel. The mine had been the catalyst, the moment the confidence of the Corsican ogre's minions finally broke, as the sun began to peek over the Spanish horizon, revealing the true extent of the devastation. The San Roque bastion was no more than a memory, a jagged scar on the face of the city. The impossible odds had been conquered, but as the smoke began to clear, the cost of the victory was becoming appallingly apparent. The butcher's bill was being tallied, and even in the moment of triumph, there was a sense of somber reflection. McGraw remained at the edge of the ditch, his work finished. He was a forgotten genius in the most literal sense, while the colonels and generals were already beginning to draft the dispatches that would claim the glory for the infantry. The sapper was simply a man looking for his shovel. He had survived the duel in the dark, the claustrophobic campaign, and the earth shudder. He had done what the horse guards said was impossible, and he had done it with the quiet military precision that defined his character. The world had shook because of him, yet he remained a silent observer of the history he had authored. The collapse of the San Roque was the turning point of the Peninsular War. It was the moment the British Army proved it could not just hold a line but break a fortress. It was a victory of engineering, of grit, and of the unregarded men who fought in the shadows. As we move into the final chapters of this story, we will look at the aftermath of this shattering moment, the immediate strategic consequences, the dark reality of the city's fall, and the enduring legacy of the man who won the war from 40 feet below the ground. The earth had shuddered, and the foundations of Napoleon's empire had begun to crack. The dawn that followed the shattering of the San Roque did not bring the clear, triumphant light of a new year, but a sickly, gray morning choked by the drifting soot of the city in its death throes. As the last pockets of French resistance were smothered in the narrow winds and blood-slicked plazas of Badajoz, the butcher's bill began to be tallied in earnest. It was a price that staggered even the most battle-hardened veterans of the Peninsular Army. Wellington, usually a man of iron-cold composure, was seen to break down and weep when he witnessed the heaps of his lost division piled high at the breaches. The keys to Spain had been won, but the cost was a generation of Britain's finest infantry, their lives traded for a few square miles of Spanish stone. The immediate aftermath was not a scene of military order, but one of terrifying, visceral chaos. The British soldier, having endured weeks of trench-bound misery and the near-supernatural terror of the assault, finally snapped. The butcher's peace was characterized by a 48-hour descent into anarchy that remains a stain upon the honor of the era. The very men who had displayed such disciplined courage in the face of McGraw's mine now turned their fury upon the city they had supposedly come to liberate. It was a dark reflection of contemporary British sentiments, a release of the British bulldog that the officers could not, or would not, restrain. In the shadowed corners of the city, the pride of the Peninsular Army became a mob, a reminder that the line between the hero and the beast is often as thin as a sapper's fuse. Amidst this maelstrom of victory and vice, the figure of Corporal James McGraw was nowhere to be found in the victory parades. While the colonels of the Light Division were already being toasted in the mess tents, the man who had actually unhinged the fortress was found by a burial party near the wreckage of the San Roque. He was alive, but barely. The concussion of the blast and the subsequent collapse of the final few yards of his tunnel had left him pinned under a timber balk for hours. He was pulled from the red clay not as a conquering hero, but as a broken piece of the military machine, his skin blackened, his hearing shattered, and his hands the tools of his forgotten genius, crushed by the weight of the mountain he had moved. There would be no medals for the tunnel rat. In the rigid hierarchy of 1812, the credit for the fall of Badajoz was distributed among the high-born and the high-ranking. The official dispatches mentioned the successful application of a mine, but the name of the corporal who had conceived it, dug it, and defended it in a Stygian duel was omitted in favor of the engineering officers who had merely signed the orders. McGraw was evacuated to a jolting hospital wagon, destined for a long, agonizing recovery in a crowded ward in Lisbon. He had secured the keys to Spain for Wellington, but he had lost his health, his trade, and his anonymity in the process. The strategic consequences, however, were undeniable. With Badajoz fallen, the French-Spanish ulcer became a terminal hemorrhage. Napoleon's hold on the south was broken, and the road to Madrid lay open. The fall of the fortress was the shattering moment for French confidence across the peninsula. Marshals Soult and Marmont, who had been marching to the city's relief, were forced to retreat, their carefully constructed defensive lines rendered useless by the loss of the border strongholds. The forgotten genius of a lowly sapper had done more to advance the British cause in a single night than a year of open-field maneuvering. Yet, as we reflect on the butcher's peace, we must confront the uncomfortable truth of the 19th century military experience. The British army of the era was a weapon of immense power but little gratitude. For the 65 Pru's demographic who understands the weight of service and the often silent nature of true sacrifice, McGraw's fate is a poignant reminder of the forgotten truths of history. The keys were turned not by the glittering swords of the elite, but by the calloused hands of men who were discarded once their utility was exhausted. The peace that followed was bought with blood, grit, and the quiet, unrecorded brilliance of a man who worked in the dark so that others might walk in the light of victory. The story of Corporal James McGraw did not end with a flourish of trumpets or a pension from a grateful parliament. Like so many of the unregarded men who forged the British Empire, he vanished into the quiet obscurity of a nation that was already looking toward its next great conflict. He returned to the rolling hills of Scotland, his body broken by the claustrophobic campaign, walking with a limp that served as a permanent reminder of the night the earth shuddered. Yet, while the man remained forgotten, the tactical genius he displayed beneath the Sandrock bastion lived on, fundamentally altering the DNA of the British military. The fall of Badajoz was the death knell for the old aristocratic disdain for engineering. It proved with bloody finality that the spade was as vital to the crown as the saber. In the years following the Peninsular War, the British High Command, those horse guards who had once scoffed at the scientific way of war, underwent a silent revolution. The Royal Military Artificers were reorganized and granted the title of sappers and miners, eventually evolving into the Royal Engineers we recognize today. The lessons McGraw bought with his sweat and blood were codified into the curriculum of the newly established Royal School of Military Engineering at Chatham. No longer would the British Army rely solely on the suicidal forlorn hope and the brute force of the bayonet. They had learned that a fortress is not a wall to be climbed, but a structural puzzle to be solved. McGraw's unprecedented maneuver became the standard operating procedure for the sieges of the Victorian era and beyond. The legacy of the tunnel rat is woven into the very fabric of British military identity. It is the legacy of the specialist, the man who values military precision over empty bravado and emotional gravitas over fleeting glory. To the 65 Prus UK male demographic, McGraw represents a familiar archetype, the silent professional who does the difficult, dangerous work without expectation of reward, driven by a deep-seated sense of duty and a mastery of his craft. He was the precursor to the tunnelers of the Great War and the combat engineers of the modern age. His forgotten genius was the realization that in the face of impossible odds, intelligence is the greatest force multiplier a soldier possesses. Today, if you visit the ruins of Badajoz, you will find monuments to the great Duke and the heroic charges of the Light Division. But if you look closely at the foundations of the Sandrock, where the ancient Moorish stone meets the red Spanish clay, you are standing on the true monument to James McGraw. It is a monument of absence, a gap in the wall where a man from the dark once stood. His victory changed war forever by proving that the Corsican shadow could be lifted by the hands of a common man, provided those hands held a pickaxe and the mind behind them held a dream of collapse. We conclude this journey with a reflective salute to the unregarded Sapper. History may not have remembered his name, but it has lived in the world he helped to build. James McGraw was the silent fuse that sparked the liberation of a continent, a forgotten genius whose sacrifice ensured that the British Lion would never again be held at bay by a wall of stone. He was the man who went into the black so that Britain might emerge into the light of a new global century. His story is a powerful testament to the fact that sometimes the most enduring victories are won 40 feet below the ground in the absolute silence of a job well done.